Hi, my name is Kirsten, and I'm a doctoral candidate and part-time professor from the University of Ottawa. In this video, I'm going to be presenting a short paper entitled Another Apocalypse: Survivance in Indigenous Science Fictions, which looks at two recent award-winning novels, Moon of the Crusted Snow and The Marrow, Thieves. But before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge that the research for this paper was conducted at the University of Ottawa, which is situated on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabeg territory. The Algonquin people are the traditional guardians of the land, and I want to recognize their long-standing relationship with the territory on which I am writing and residing. As a settler scholar, I honor the fact that the Indigenous peoples of North America have what Helen Hoy terms epistemic privilege, which means that they have superior knowledge of their own situation. As a result, this presentation will draw primarily on the research of Indigenous scholars to establish a theoretical background, and each will first be introduced by noting their particular nation as a means of recognizing the ongoing relationship between Indigenous peoples, both historically and today, and the region that they hail from, as well as the one they currently call home. In 2018, scientists from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change claimed that humans must take unprecedented steps to radically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. Anthropogenic climate change has led to an increase in the frequency and intensity of daily temperature extremes and has contributed to a widespread intensification of daily precipitation extremes, while also multiplying the likelihood of extreme weather and climate events. The impact of human-caused climate change is already being felt globally, with devastating wildfires, melting polar ice caps, rising sea levels, mass species extinction, and abnormal weather events. These factors ultimately make world annihilation seem more likely than ever before. Given the situation, it is perhaps unsurprising that post-apocalyptic fiction has grown in popularity, with the publication of climate fiction steadily rising since the turn of the millennium. Many, though not all, of these post-apocalyptic novels are ultimately cynical about a politics of change or liberation, often exposing a future defined by grim determinism that reinforces preset structures of oppression. While some post-apocalyptic narratives depict the end of our current system purely as an entropic disruption of what they consider to be progress, Waubgeshig Rice's Moon of the Crusted Snow and Cherie Dimaline's The Marrow, Thieves both reverse the polarity of those discussions by framing the apocalypse as a politically mobilizing and agency-creating mechanism. In Rice's novel, settler Canadian communities struggle to survive the unprecedented weather conditions because of their reliance on modern technology. Indigenous communities, however, who've already experienced many apocalyptic events since the colonization of Canada began in the late 15th century, are represented as being better suited to survive and prosper in a changing world. Similarly, in Dimaline's novel, the world has been nearly destroyed by global warming, and with this unprecedented damage, the majority of people lost the ability to dream. As a result, Indigenous people, who retained the ability to dream, were hunted and killed for their bone marrow, which seems to be the key to recovering what everyone else had lost. By finding community and not only preserving but rebuilding their knowledge of their language, stories, and traditions, the protagonists ultimately discover the secret to defeating the Marrow Thieves and ensuring the ongoing survival of their people. This paper thus argues that both Rice's and Dimaline's novels provide a scenario in which the traditional knowledge, language, and stories of Indigenous peoples become a tool for survivance, a term used by Anishinaabe cultural theorist Gerald Vizener to describe an active and thriving sense of presence, thus allowing First Nations communities to take full advantage of the utopian possibility of beginning again. In the first chapter of Survivance, Narratives of Native Presence, Vizener argues that while theories of survivance are elusive, obscure, and imprecise by definition, the nature of survivance is a distinctive sense of presence over absence that permeates throughout a large number of Indigenous stories, natural reason, remembrance, traditions, and customs. Consequently, both novels follow in the convention of living the Indigenous future that Lindsay Nixon, an Anishinaabe-Nehiwa writer and scholar, describes as the outcome of the intentions, resistance, and survivance of their ancestors. We are thus already witness to narratives of Indigenous survivance. In recent decades, there's been a growing body of speculative fictions in which Indigenous authors use the traditions of their own peoples as guiding principles in imagining possible futures for themselves and their communities. Apocalypse narratives in particular have a tendency to posit the possibility of an optimistic future, despite the fact that the native apocalypse, as Grace L. Dillon, an Anishinaabe scholar, has termed it, has already taken place, despite the fact that many Indigenous communities are recovering from what Lawrence Gross, an Anishinaabe scholar, calls post-apocalyptic stress syndrome. They have survived and will continue to survive and thrive despite ongoing encounters with colonial forces that intend otherwise. Reflecting on past traumas while projecting the endurance of Indigenous communities into the future, Rice and Dimaline actively subvert the death imaginary ascribed to Indigenous bodies within settler colonial discourse, which essentially purports that Indigenous peoples must always be disappearing in order to legitimize settler occupation and the Canadian state. In Rice's novel, when the already isolated Northern Reserve becomes almost completely cut off from the outside world in the midst of an early and unpredictable winter, perhaps the result of a changing climate, it seems as though the apocalypse has befallen their community. Similarly, Dimaline's novel is set in a world that has already been ravaged by climate change, and with all the sickness and death associated with it, people got sad. One of the ways that sadness came out was when they slept. They stopped being able to dream. In both these dystopian scenarios, survival, I argue, is dependent on narrative memory, which is developed through an interconnection between space, memory, and ancestor, the building of stories upon one another. Storytelling is the conduit through which intergenerational knowledge is passed, allowing narrative to map a people's collective relationship to a specific area, and provide wisdom from voice and memory within a landscape. Neil MacLeod, a scholar of Cree and Swedish descent, identifies the removal of Indigenous groups from their land as a form of spatial diaspora. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the term diaspora as being any group of people who have spread or become dispersed beyond their traditional homeland. As a result, I argue that in Rice's novel, when the ancestors of these Anishinaabe people were forced to settle in this unfamiliar land distant from their traditional home near the Great Lakes, they become part of a spatial diaspora. So too do the characters in the Marrow Thieves, who have been repeatedly displaced from their communities for centuries because of the ongoing impacts of colonization. French's mom, for instance, tells her children that there were generations in their family where all they did was move, first by choice, then every time the black cars came from town and burned out their homes along the roadside. In his 2001 article, Coming Home Through Stories, MacLeod claims that the effects of spatial diaspora are devastating upon Indigenous people, because they create a condition of alienation that exists both in their hearts and in their physical alienation from the land. Essentially, by removing the community from their traditional lands, colonialism forced its people to live a disjointed life, in which the discourse and the physical reality surrounding this discourse of exile are imposed upon the people thrown into diaspora. Additionally, the colonial presence attempted to destroy the collective consciousness of Indigenous communities by alienating them from their stories and removing their peoples from the voices and echoes of their ancestors, in what MacLeod refers to as ideological diaspora. The culture of the community in Moon of the Crusted Snow withered under the pressure of the incomers' language and religion, as the population was made to endure forced and often violent assimilation at the hands of the colonizers. Rice's fictional Anishinaabe community was thus forced into a diaspora in two overlapping senses, spatial and ideological, by an ongoing colonial presence, essentially placing their people in a state of exile in the Canadian nation-state. But significantly, Rice's novel follows a tradition of Indigenous storytelling in which the apocalypse shows the ruptures, the scars, and the trauma in its effort to provide healing. Despite violent attempts to remove the Anishinaabe people and their way of life from existence, this erasure was ultimately unsuccessful, because people like Aileen, her parents, and a few others had kept the old ways alive in secret, by whispering the stories and language in each other's ears. Similarly, the Marrow Thieves depict story as a tool that allows Indigenous peoples the ability to return, rebuild, relearn, and regroup. Story is represented as something that must be remembered, and so it's the storyteller's job to set the memory in perpetuity, as a means of ensuring that it's possible for the survivors to make the kinds of changes necessary to really survive. So despite the fact that in both novels, Indigenous populations were forced into a state of diaspora, the preservation work performed by community elders ensured that some semblance of an ideological home was maintained. And it is exactly this ability to dwell in the landscape of the familiar, collective memories, as opposed to being in exile, that enables the novel's communities to survive. Moon of the Crusted Snow opens in autumn, with Evan Whitesky hunting bull moose to prepare for the winter months. As a child, Evan's father had first taught him to identify and follow moose tracks in the deep bush around their reserve when he was 5, which enabled him nearly 20 years later to track his own kill to support his young family. In the year the novel is set, this winter preparation is key to the success of Evan's family and the community overall. Fortunately, those in the community who had grown up in families that believed in teaching their kids how to live on the land and who knew how to hunt, fish, and trap were able to draw on their traditions to perform the basics of winter survival. That said, even though some members of the community did not spend all summer fishing and all fall hunting to feed their family in the winter, the community maintained an emergency supply cache that was distributed among the population according to each home's need. This sharing demonstrates the capacity small communities have to support one another in times of crisis. On a smaller scale, Evan also functions as a provider for the community at large because he was planning to give a lot of his meat away. Sharing was the community way. Adherence to traditional social structures thus promotes a system in which the community provides for one another, essentially taking care of those who do not have enough to thrive on their own. And when catastrophe strikes, it is this nature of sharing that enables the survival of the population. Community also plays a significant role in the Marrow Thieves, where Indigenous survivors, who are on the run to ensure their survival, come together to form what Dimaline calls a patchwork family. At the beginning of the novel, there are 7 members in their group, 5 boys and 2 girls, not including the elders. And not one of them were related by blood, and many of them came from different nations. For instance, some members are Métis, some members identify with their ancestral lands on the East Coast or in White River, some are Cree, some are Anishinaabe, and some come from mixed heritages. Despite their differences, their shared experiences with colonization, both past and present, as well as the will to survive and ensure the ongoing presence of themselves, their families, and their communities, connect them so strongly that they would do anything and everything to save each other if need be. After all, this makeshift community was all they had. Together, they took turns splitting into groups, hunting, and homestead, switching off every 3 months. In these groups, the elders, Mig and Minerva, imparted their wisdom on the youth, teaching them everything from shelter building, cooking, foraging, tracking, hunting, and weapon making. These skills, which Mig compared to a sort of apocalyptic Boy Scouts, ensured the younger generations were provided with the skills to survive in a world where many modern conveniences were no longer accessible. By working separately but together, the makeshift family is able to ensure their continued survival while on the run. Though colonialism placed severe pressures on Indigenous culture, it was ultimately unsuccessful because people still found ways to preserve their identity and their place in the world. In particular, stories and languages led some people back to their identities, essentially allowing them to find true dignity and integrity in the world. By encouraging a revival of traditional ways of life, MacLeod argues that stories act as the vehicles of cultural transmission, by linking one generation to the next, which enables the possibility of cultural transmission and of coming home in an ideological sense. And considering the diasporic condition of the novel's Indigenous peoples, the ability to find a home within the context of narrative represents the significance of the continuation of stories to Indigenous survivance overall. In the wake of yet another apocalypse, story is thus essential to the preservation of the community. While colonialism caused a radical separation with the past that triggered a disjunction in the daily experience of the people, MacLeod purports the idea that every time a story is told, every time one word of an Indigenous language is spoken, nations are resisting the destruction of their collective memory, essentially declaring the ongoing existence of Indigenous peoples. Moreover, the catastrophe facing Rice's fictional community creates the conditions in which traditional knowledge becomes not merely an expression of survivance, but also a necessary tool for survival in a radically shifting world. In the Marrow Thieves, language plays a key role in the ongoing fight for survival. When Minerva is captured by the Marrow Thieves, she hummed and drummed out an old song on her flannel thighs throughout it all. But when the wires were fastened to her own neural networks, and when she called on her blood memory, her teachings, her ancestors, that's when she brought the whole thing down. Using the power of songs which were sung in her own language, Cree, Minerva was able to preserve every dream she'd ever dreamed in the language, which caused the wires to spark, the probes to malfunction, the computers to glitch and fail, and ultimately burned School 47E to the ground. Knowing the power that language has against the oppressive colonial system inspires the survivors to begin piecing together the few words and images each of them carried. They wrote what they could, drew pictures, and made the camp recite what was known for sure as a means of passing on the teachings right away while they were still learning themselves. Language reclamation thus represents hope for the defeat of the oppressive colonial system and for the resurgence of Indigenous ways of being. By drawing on their stories, language, and traditions, the characters in the Marrow Thieves are able to survive again, just as they survived many times before. Accordingly, Martina Mittag argued that conventional utopia and apocalypse are complicit in their desire for a better world, meaning that these genres are linked by an optimism that a better world is possible. Because narratives of the apocalypse ultimately exemplify a dystopian impulse defined by destruction and catastrophe and a utopian impulse that fuels hope for the future, Moon of the Crusted Snow and the Marrow Thieves demonstrate the ways in which the annihilation of one society can ultimately lead to the rebirth of another. In the front book flap, Rice writes, "As one society collapses, another is reborn." And while the collapsing society may refer to settler-occupied urban centers like Gibson, I believe it also refers to the collapse of colonial influence on the Anishinaabe peoples, which allows for a rekindling of their traditional ways of life. In Moon of the Crusted Snow, apocalyptic events thus express the potential to reverse the alienating effects of spatial and ideological diaspora. The end of the novel thus demonstrates that the complete isolation of the community had collapsed the majority of the systems introduced by settler colonial influences. While this disruption initially acts as a hindrance to the well-being of the community at large, the isolation eventually allows for a broad reversion to the pre-colonial traditions that had sustained their people for centuries. The act of coming home through stories is therefore manifested throughout Moon of the Crusted Snow and the Marrow Thieves. Narrative ensures that traditional knowledge is passed between generations, creating a toolbox for surviving in a world without modern conveniences, where the only way to survive is by drawing on the pre-colonial knowledge of their ancestors. As a result, Waubgeshig Rice's 2018 novel Moon of the Crusted Snow and Cherie Dimaline's 2017 novel The Marrow Thieves can be understood as critical dystopias, which allow readers and protagonists to hope, thus maintaining the utopian impulse within the work. Instead of depicting apocalyptic events purely as an entropic disruption of progress, these authors reverse the polarity of those discussions by framing the apocalypse as a politically mobilizing and agency-creating mechanism that allows Indigenous peoples to build on traditional knowledge about how to survive using the resources available and succeed in a new world. Throughout both novels, the Indigenous communities maintain an active and thriving sense of presence despite the ongoing and simultaneous apocalypses of colonization and climate change. Therefore, Moon of the Crusted Snow and the Marrow Thieves can be considered narratives of survivance, demonstrating that through stories, language, traditions, and customs, the Indigenous people living in the Canadian nation-state will continue to survive and thrive, even if yet another apocalyptic event comes their way. While the end is characterized by the utopian possibility of starting again, Rice and Dimaline prove that Indigenous populations already have what they need to endure and prosper in a changing world marked by the threat of anthropogenic climate change. Thank you for listening.